Hey guys, tonight we step into the strange, theatrical, and deeply exaggerated world of Tudor England. An age of glittering courts, nervous nobles, questionable medical advice, and enough propaganda to make a modern political campaign look subtle. But here's the question you should be asking yourself right now. How many of the things you believe about the Tudors are actually just Hollywood fiction dressed up as history? Did Henry VIII really start out as a monster? Or did something else change him? Did Tudor women actually have no power, or have we just not been paying attention? And did everyone really smell that bad, or is that just a story we tell ourselves to feel superior? Before we find out, take a moment. Like the video, and subscribe if you genuinely want to know what history got wrong. And let me know in the comments which Tudor lie surprised you the most. Now dim the lights, get comfortable, and let us step into the truth behind Tudor England together. One of the biggest lies people still believe about Tudor England is that absolutely everyone smelled horrific all the time. According to modern imagination, the entire country existed inside one giant invisible cloud made of sweat and mud and onions and wet sheep and something that smells like emotional suffering. Films love portraying Tudor people as permanently filthy creatures who bathed once a year whether they needed to or not, and who stumbled through life marinating in their own neglect while the rest of history judged them from a safe distance. But here's where the story gets strange and a little uncomfortable. Tudor cities absolutely smell bad. London especially was crowded and smoky and loud and filled with enough human and animal waste to make a modern sanitation engineer burst into tears immediately. Streets were covered in mud and horse manure and rotten food, and things nobody asked too many questions about. Chamber pots were emptied from upper windows directly into the streets below, which made walking through London less of a pleasant stroll and more of a tactical military exercise involving constant prayer and very fast reflexes. The River Thames often looked like it had personally given up on humanity and decided to become a public health experiment instead. So yes, the odor was real. But here is the lie. The lie is that Tudor people themselves did not care. The lie is that they walked around proud of their filth and unaware that anything was wrong. That version of history is comforting because it lets us feel superior. The truth is far more intimate and far more human. Tudor people washed their hands and faces and bodies whenever they could. Wealthier households bought scented soaps and oils and perfumes and herbal rinses imported from Europe at great expense. Clean linen underclothes were considered absolutely essential because people genuinely believed that fresh linen absorbed sweat and dirt from the body. In many ways, they treated clean shirts the way modern people treat therapy apps. Something expensive, but necessary. Something that keeps you functional in public. Nobles at court were especially obsessed with smell. Pleasant scents represented wealth and health and sophistication and something else too. Something unspoken, something that hovered just beneath the surface of every courtly interaction. Because in Tudor England, smell was not just about comfort. It was about desire. It was about who you allowed close to your body and who you kept at a distance. Wealthy men and women carried pomanders, little metal balls filled with flowers and spices and ambergris designed to block the foul odors around them. But here's what the history books do not say out loud. Those pomanders were also invitations. To lean close to someone in Tudor court was to smell them, to be allowed close enough to catch the rose and cinnamon and musk rising from their clothes and skin. That was intimacy. That was trust. That was the quiet language of people who understood that behind every polite conversation there was always a body. And bodies in Tudor England were complicated. They sweated. They ached. They wanted things that polite society refused to name. So the wealthy masked themselves in luxury. They perfumed their skin and their hair and their linen because they knew that everyone around them was also a body, also hungry, also watching. Even poorer households attempted regular washing when they had access to water and time. Public bathhouses had existed for centuries, though many declined after outbreaks of disease caused people to associate communal baths with sickness and with something else too, something the church frowned upon. The same bathhouses that offered cleanliness also offered darker possibilities. candlelit rooms where steam covered more than just the skin, whispers exchanged between wet walls, encounters that never appeared in any official record. By the Tudor era, many of those places have been closed or driven underground. But human nature does not disappear just because a door gets locked. It finds other doors. The myth survives because modern people compare Tudor hygiene to modern plumbing. But that comparison is dishonest. Future historians will probably judge us too. Imagine explaining energy drinks and artificial cheese powder and people screaming at strangers online about celebrities they have never met. Archaeologists of the future may simply cancel us out of respect. Tudor England still smelled unpleasant overall. Dentistry was terrifying. Sewage systems barely functioned. But the idea that Tudors proudly wandered around marinating in filth for months at a time is mostly fiction. They disliked bad smells just as much as we do. They simply lacked deodorant and indoor plumbing and the revolutionary modern invention known as not throwing human waste directly outside. So why does the lie survive? Because it is easier to imagine the past as dirty and stupid than to admit that they were just like us, trying to be clean, trying to be desired, trying to hide the things their bodies revealed without permission. The next time you imagine a Tudor noble leaning close to whisper something in the ear of a lover or a rival, remember this. What they smelled was not neglect. It was rose oil and cinnamon and clean linen and something underneath all of that. Something warm and alive and completely human. And that is far more interesting than a cartoon peasant rolling in mud. Now from the smells that clung to their skin, let us turn to the king whose body told a story no one wanted to hear. The truth about Henry VIII and the lie that made him a monster from birth. Now from the smells that clung to their skin, let us turn to the king whose body told a story no one wanted to hear. The truth about Henry VIII and the lie that made him a monster from birth. One of the biggest misconceptions about Tudor England is the image of Henry VIII as a gigantic, furious king who spent his entire life stomping through castles, demanding executions, and roasted meat every 15 minutes while servants scrambled to stay out of his shadow. Late in life, yes, he absolutely became enormous. By his final years, Henry struggled to walk properly. He suffered from severe leg ulcers that wept constantly and reportedly needed special devices to help move his body around the palace. Court servants had the deeply unfortunate responsibility of assisting a king who had essentially become a heavily decorated avalanche. But here is the question the paintings never answer. What made him that way? The lie says Henry was always a monster. Born cruel. Born hungry for power and wives and blood. The truth is far more uncomfortable and far more intimate. Young Henry was almost unrecognizable compared to the man he later became. In his youth, he was considered one of the most impressive princes in Europe. Tall and athletic and educated and charming and obsessed with physical competition. He hunted for hours. He wrestled. He jousted in dangerous tournaments where one wrong move meant death. He played tennis. He danced at court celebrations until dawn. He constantly tried to display his strength and his elegance because he wanted to be looked at. He wanted to be desired. Foreign ambassadors praised his appearance constantly. Some described him as the perfect Renaissance prince. He had bright red gold hair and powerful legs from years of riding and endless confidence that bordered on arrogance, but never quite crossed into cruelty. If Tudor England had fitness influencers, Henry would absolutely have been standing in front of polished armor whispering about discipline and greatness before immediately eating an entire swan, because even the perfect prince had appetites. And those appetites were part of his charm. He also loved fashion with terrifying intensity. Henry wore silk and velvet and jewels and embroidered fabrics and golden chains and feathered hats and padded outfits designed to make him appear even broader and more dominant. Some of his clothes were so overloaded with decoration that he probably jingled slightly while walking through corridors. And people noticed. People always noticed Henry. He wanted them to notice. He wanted the women at court to watch him enter a room. He wanted their eyes on his shoulders and his legs and the way his clothing moved against his body. He was young and powerful and handsome, and he knew exactly what that combination did to the people around him. But bodies change, and power changes what bodies are allowed to become. Everything began shifting after years of injuries and political stress. The most important turning point came during a jousting accident when Henry was thrown from his horse and badly injured. Historians believe the accident permanently damaged his health and possibly affected his personality as well. A leg wound that should have healed did not. It festered. It became a hole in his body that never closed. Imagine living with that. Imagine being the most powerful man in England and knowing that somewhere beneath your velvet and gold there was something rotten, something that smelled, something that no amount of perfume could hide. After that, Henry became less active. He gained enormous weight. He grew increasingly paranoid. Chronic pain from infected leg wounds followed him constantly. He could not sleep. He could not sit comfortably. He could not perform the athletic feats that had once made him feel invincible. And here is where the story turns dark in a way that has nothing to do with executions. Advisors who had once been friends disappeared from favor suddenly. Court politics became more dangerous. Wives learned that royal marriage occasionally ended with unexpected appointments beside execution blocks. But what caused all of that was not simply cruelty. It was shame. A man who had built his identity on being the most desirable prince in Europe could not bear to be seen as weak. So he became feared instead. If people could not love his body, they would obey his power. He surrounded himself with people too terrified to tell him no. He ate more. He drank more. He withdrew from the tournaments and the dances and the public displays of youth. And the women in his life paid the price for his pain. Catherine of Aragon was set aside because she could not give him a son, but she also could not give him the admiring gaze he needed. And Boleyn, who had once made him feel young and reckless, was destroyed when she no longer reflected his glory back at him. Jane Seymour gave him the son and then gave him nothing else because she died. And the wives who followed existed in the shadow of a king who hated what he had become. The truth is far more uncomfortable than a myth. Henry was not born as a monstrous tyrant. He slowly transformed into one through pain and fear and unchecked power and years of watching his own body betray him. That does not excuse what he did. History is full of people who suffered without becoming executioners. But it explains something that the simple lie of the fat, angry king cannot touch. It explains how desire curdles into control. How a man who once wanted to be loved ends up settling for being dreaded because dread is easier to guarantee. Imagine being one of the women at court. Imagine watching the young golden prince become something else. Imagine noticing the way his eyes changed after the accident. The way his touch became heavier. The way he no longer invited admiration, but demanded it. And imagine knowing that you could not say no. That is the real horror of Henry VIII. Not the size of his body, but the size of his loneliness and what he did to fill it. Now from the king who ruled through fear, let us turn to the women who found power in places no one thought to look. The truth about Tudor women and the lie that made them invisible. Now from the king who ruled through fear, let us turn to the women who found power in places no one thought to look. The truth about Tudor women and a lie that made them invisible. One of the most persistent myths about Tudor England is the idea that women had absolutely no influence and spent their entire lives silently sewing beside fireplaces while men handled politics and business and all the important decisions that move the world forward. The lie is comfortable because it simplifies everything. Men were powerful. Women were not. Men acted. Women waited. But history is rarely that clean, and human desire is never that obedient. Tudor society was undeniably patriarchal. Men controlled most official positions of authority. Women faced major legal restrictions, and marriage often determined a woman's entire future. But the popular image of Tudor women as powerless decorative furniture is deeply misleading. In reality, women constantly influenced Tudor society in ways both visible and hidden. And some of those ways involve things that polite history books prefer to leave in shadow. Consider the noble women first. They managed enormous households that functioned almost like small governments. They supervised servants and handled finances and arranged marriages and organized supplies and oversaw education and maintained family alliances through networks of correspondence that would make a modern political strategist dizzy with admiration. Running a large Tudor estate required intelligence and diplomacy and the kind of emotional calculation that most men never learned because they were too busy posing for portraits and developing very serious opinions about hats. But here's what the records do not say directly. These women also knew secrets. They knew which marriages were happy and which were not. They knew which husbands visited other chambers at night. They knew which servants could be trusted and which ones watched too closely. And they used that knowledge. A Tudor noblewoman could destroy a rival with a whispered word in the right ear. She could elevate a favorite by arranging the right marriage. She could protect her children by positioning them in households where they would be seen and remembered. These were not acts of passive obedience. They were acts of quiet war fought with letters and glances and the careful control of who stood next to whom at dinner. And because the battlefield was the household itself, no one thought to call it politics. But it was politics, the most intimate kind. Many women also worked outside noble life. Women brewed ale and sold goods in markets and managed shops and worked in textiles and helped run family businesses while their husbands traveled or drank or pretended to be in charge. Widows especially could gain surprising independence because they sometimes inherited property or commercial responsibilities. A widow who controlled her late husband's business was a woman who answered to no man about her finances. And a woman who answered to no man about her finances could make choices that other women could not. She could choose her lovers. She could refuse a second marriage. She could live alone in a world that told her she should not want to. Then there was Elizabeth I, who spent decades ruling England while male advisors repeatedly attempted to explain leadership to the actual Queen of England. A truly timeless male tradition. Elizabeth understood politics brilliantly. She transformed her public image into a weapon. Her speeches and portraits and clothing and behavior were all carefully controlled to project authority and stability. She delayed marriage negotiations strategically using foreign princes like pieces on a diplomatic chessboard while avoiding the danger of surrendering political power to a husband. Because Tudor marriage was not romantic equality. A husband often gained enormous control over his wife's property and influence and decisions. But Elizabeth had another reason for staying unmarried, one that historians sometimes whisper about but rarely state plainly. She had seen what marriage did to women. She had watched her father destroy wives who could not give him what he wanted. She had watched her sister marry Philip of Spain and lose authority over her own kingdom. Elizabeth understood that to marry was to submit, and she refused to submit to any man. Not because she hated men, because she valued power more than she valued the safety of a ring on her finger. There are rumors about Elizabeth and Robert Dudley. Rumors that suggest she was not cold or unloving, but that she chose the crown over the man she might have wanted. History does not know for certain what happened behind her chamber doors, but history knows that she kept Dudley close, very close, for decades, and that she never let anyone else take his place. Of course, life remained brutally unfair for many ordinary women. Domestic abuse was common. Education opportunities were limited. Childbirth was dangerous in ways that modern medicine has mostly erased, and social expectations were extremely strict. A woman's reputation could collapse from rumors alone. A glance held too long. A conversation that continued after dark. A visit to a man's chamber for any reason at all. Tudor society judged women constantly, often by standards invented 5 minutes earlier by nervous religious men who seemed deeply preoccupied with what women did when no one was watching. But women still shape politics and economies and religion and family life every single day. The myth survives partly because history books spent centuries focusing almost entirely on powerful men, while countless women quietly managed households and businesses and estates and political alliances, and the men around them posed dramatically for portraits and never noticed who was actually holding the room together. Think about the women in your own life. The ones who know where everything is. The ones who remember every birthday and every slight and every secret whispered years ago. The ones who smile politely while calculating exactly how to get what they want. Tudor England was full of those women. They just could not say so out loud. So the next time someone tells you Tudor women had no power, ask yourself who was really watching from the corners of the room, who was listening to every conversation while appearing to sow, who knew which marriages were failing and which ministers were lying and which queens were sleeping where they should not have been. Power does not always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a linen cap and smiles like it has nothing to hide. Now from the women who ruled in secret, let us turn to a different kind of lie. The one about the shape of the world itself and the Tudors who never believed it. Now from the women who ruled in secret, let us turn to a different kind of lie. The one about the shape of the world itself and the Tudors who never believed it. One of the strangest myths people still believe about the Tudor era is that everyone thought the earth was flat until modern civilization heroically arrived to rescue humanity from its own stupidity. According to this version of history, Tudor sailors supposedly stood nervously on ships, whispering, "Careful, lads, we're getting dangerously close to the edge of existence," which would have made global exploration somewhat difficult. The image is almost funny. A brave captain peering into the fog, while his crew clutches the railing, expecting to see waterfalls and dragons and the bottomless dark. But like most funny stories, this one is completely wrong. Here is the truth that the flat earth myth hides. Educated Europeans had known the earth was round for centuries before the Tudors ever wore their first codpiece. Ancient Greek scholars had calculated the earth's circumference with surprising accuracy long before the Tudor dynasty even existed. Medieval universities taught the concept openly. Tudor navigators absolutely understood it. Sailors used astronomy and maps and mathematical calculations regularly to cross oceans and find their way home again. The idea of a spherical Earth was not controversial among educated people. What people argued about was not whether the Earth was round, but how big it actually was. And that is where the story gets interesting. Because the size of the Earth mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with desire. Desire for gold and spices and new lands, and the kind of wealth that could make a man powerful enough to rewrite his own destiny. Christopher Columbus, for example, incorrectly believed that Asia was much closer to Europe than it really was. He was not afraid of falling off the edge. He was afraid of running out of supplies before he reached the riches he had promised to his Spanish patrons. He accidentally encountered continents standing directly in the way of his calculations. An awkward moment historically, though probably exciting for geography. But why does the flat earth myth survive? Why do intelligent people in the 21st century still believe that their ancestors were too simple to understand what every sailor already knew? The answer is uncomfortable. The flat earth medieval people myth became popular much later, especially during the 19th century. Writers and intellectuals wanted to portray earlier centuries as hopelessly ignorant, so modern society would appear dramatically enlightened by comparison. Which is funny because future historians will probably look at us and wonder why we willingly consumed fluorescent energy drinks while arguing online with strangers named things like Dragon King 6942. Every generation believes it has finally defeated human stupidity forever. Every generation is immediately proven wrong. There is something almost intimate about this particular lie. It flatters us. It whispers that we are the smart ones, the clean ones, the ones who finally understand how the world works. And it invites us to look down on the people who came before as children playing at knowledge. But that invitation hides a darker truth. If we can believe such a simple lie about the Tudors, what else have we believed without question? What other myths are we carrying around right now about the past that make us feel superior while being completely false? Tudor people may have believed some questionable things, of course. Astrology influenced medicine. Comets terrified populations. Many people thought illness came from bad air drifting around cities like invisible punishment smoke. To be fair, after walking through Tudor London, the air probably did feel personally hostile. But educated Tudors understood astronomy surprisingly well for the time. Navigation improved rapidly during the 16th century, and explorers depended on sophisticated calculations while traveling enormous distances. No sailor feared falling off the edge of the planet. They feared storms and starvation and disease and pirates and shipwrecks and mutiny and dying slowly somewhere unfamiliar, while a captain insisted everything was completely under control, which honestly sounds much more realistic. There's another layer to this lie that rarely gets discussed. The flat Earth myth is not just about science. It is about trust. Who gets to tell the story of the past? Who gets to decide what people knew and when they knew it? The men who invented the flat Earth myth in the 19th century were not neutral historians. They were building a narrative that made their own era look like the pinnacle of human achievement. They were flattering their readers, flattering themselves, and they were willing to lie about centuries of human knowledge to do it. Think about what that means for the Tudors themselves. A Tudor sailor, standing on the deck of a ship at night, looked up at the same stars we see. He navigated by constellations that had names his ancestors gave him. He understood that those stars moved in patterns that could be predicted and measured and trusted. He did not think he was standing on a flat disk floating through nothing. He knew he was on a sphere. He knew because he could see the curve in the way ships disappeared over the horizon. Hull first, then deck, then mast, then gone. He knew because the stars changed as he traveled north or south. He knew because the men who taught him to sail had learned from other men who learned from the Greeks and the Arabs and the Phoenicians before them. The real lesson here is not that Tudor people were foolish. It is that history often gets rewritten into simplified stories where the past becomes dramatically dumber than it actually was. Mostly because complicated truth is less convenient than feeling superior to dead people. And feeling superior is a kind of desire too. The desire to be special, to be the ones who finally figured it out. The desire to look back at everyone who came before and whisper we would never have been that stupid. But we are that stupid. About different things maybe, in different ways. But the capacity for confident wrongness is not a modern invention. It is a human inheritance. The Tudors had it. We have it. The people who will laugh at us 500 years from now will have it too. The difference is they will get to feel superior about our mistakes while making their own in private. Now from the shape of the earth, let us turn to the shape of the Tudor table. The truth about food and the lie that made every meal look like punishment. Now from the shape of the earth, let us turn to the shape of the Tudor table. The truth about food and the lie that made every meal look like punishment. One of the most repeated myths about Tudor England is that everyone ate nothing but gray soup and stale bread while huddled sadly beside a dying candle waiting for the plague to finish its work. Films love portraying Tudor feasts as miserable affairs where even the wealthy ate like people who had given up on joy. The plates are wooden. The meat is suspicious. The vegetables appear to have been boiled sometime last week and left to reflect on their choices. But like most comforting lies, this one collapses the moment you look closely at what actually crossed a Tudor table. Here is the reality that Hollywood does not want you to see. Wealthy Tudor households ate enormous varieties of food that would make a modern chef weep with envy. Royal feasts included roasted meats and pies and fish and cheeses and fruits and pastries and custards and sugar desserts and imported wines and exotic spices from Asia and the Middle East. Cinnamon and cloves and nutmeg and ginger and saffron were prized symbols of wealth and power. If your dinner contained enough spice, people assumed you were either very important or dangerously irresponsible with money. Often both. But the story of Tudor food is not just about ingredients. It is about theater and status and the most intimate kind of performance. Banquets became elaborate theatrical productions designed to impress guests with the host's wealth and taste and secret knowledge. Noble tables displayed dozens of dishes at once, sometimes more for visual intimidation than actual eating. Sugar sculptures shaped like castles and animals and mythological scenes decorated feasts like edible propaganda. Some pies even contained live birds released dramatically during meals because apparently Tudor nobles occasionally planned dinners the same way modern people plan gender reveal parties, with similarly confusing levels of chaos and a much higher chance of bird feathers in the wine. The rich especially loved showing off through food. A roasted peacock could be served with its colorful feathers reattached afterwards so guests could admire the bird before eating it, which feels unnecessarily aggressive toward the peacock, but you have to admire the commitment to presentation. There was something almost erotic about these displays. The abundance, the excess, the way food became a language of desire, spoken through sugar and spice, and the careful arrangement of meat on silver platters. To dine at a Tudor noble's table was to be seduced by wealth, to taste things that ordinary people could only imagine, to feel the host's power entering your body with every bite. Poorer Tudors naturally ate simpler meals. Bread and cheese and pottage and vegetables and onions and oats and ale formed the backbone of daily life for ordinary families. Meat existed, but was less common for poorer households. Seasonal foods mattered enormously because refrigeration did not exist. Winter diets could become repetitive very quickly. Imagine spending months staring at turnips while trying to convince yourself that this counts as culinary excitement. But even poor Tudor cooking was not flavorless survival food. People used herbs constantly. Rosemary and sage and parsley and thyme and mint appeared in many dishes. Cooking techniques were surprisingly advanced, especially in kitchens where women had been practicing their craft since childhood. There is an intimacy to Tudor food that modern descriptions usually miss. The kitchen was often the warmest room in the house, the place where families gathered not just to eat, but to be together in the dark winter months. A pot of pottage simmering over the fire filled the home with smells that meant safety and survival and the quiet promise that someone was taking care of you. That smell is lost to history now. We cannot recreate it any more than we can recreate the feeling of a Tudor child falling asleep near the hearth while her mother stirred the evening meal. Tudor cuisine also included recipes that sound deeply concerning today. Wealthy people consumed swan and porpoise, and occasionally things that modern menus wisely avoid mentioning. There were pies filled with songbirds and dishes made from animal parts that most contemporary cooks would throw away without a second thought. This was not because Tudors were strange or unsophisticated. It was because they lived in a world where wasting food meant wasting life. Every part of the animal was used. Every scrap of bread was saved for pottage. Every herb growing by the door had a name and a purpose and a story attached to it. Medical theories about food were equally bizarre and equally intimate. Certain foods were believed to affect personality and emotions and bodily balance in ways that seemed strange to modern science, but made perfect sense in a world where the body was understood as a delicate ecosystem. Eating the wrong food could supposedly transform your entire health and your mood and your desirability as a partner. Cold foods made you melancholy. Hot foods made you passionate. Sweet things made you loving. Sour things made you difficult. To be fair, modern internet wellness influencers are not dramatically different. They just use different words to sell the same promise. That what you eat can change who you are and who wants you. The biggest misconception is that Tudor people lived on miserable food because they lacked sophistication. In truth, food was central to Tudor culture and status and hospitality and entertainment and desire itself. The same desire that drove Henry to devour whole feasts while his leg ulcer wept beneath the table. The same desire that made Elizabeth keep sugar sculptures on her dinner table while her teeth rotted in her head. The same desire that sends us to expensive restaurants today and makes us photograph our plates before taking the first bite. Humanity has always loved overeating at social gatherings while pretending it is somehow historically important. So the next time you imagine a Tudor meal, do not picture gray soup and sad bread. Picture a table groaning under the weight of roasted birds and spiced wine and sugar castles and the kind of abundance that makes you want to reach out and touch something beautiful. Picture the warmth of the fire and the press of bodies and the low hum of conversation. Picture the way hunger and satisfaction and longing all mix together in the candlelight. That is the real Tudor feast, not punishment, celebration. Now from a food that filled their tables, let us turn to the years that filled their lives. The truth about Tudor life expectancy and the lie that said everyone died young. Now from a food that filled their tables, let us turn to the years that filled their lives. The truth about Tudor life expectancy and the lie that said everyone died young. One of the most repeated myths about Tudor England is the claim that people rarely lived past their mid-30s. According to popular imagination, the average Tudor citizen apparently woke up each morning already halfway to the grave and stumbled through a handful of decades before death, arrived sometime around age 35. This number gets repeated constantly in documentaries and articles and casual conversations about the past. It has become one of those facts that everyone knows without ever questioning where it came from. But like most numbers that sound too dramatic to be true, this one is deeply misleading. Here is what that statistic actually measures. Infant and child mortality in Tudor England was horrifyingly high. Perhaps half of all children died before reaching adolescence. Some estimates are even worse. A child born into a Tudor village had a terrifying chance of never seeing their 10th birthday. Disease and malnutrition and accidents and childbirth complications carried away the very young with a ruthlessness that modern parents cannot truly imagine. And those deaths pull the average down. They drag the number toward the ground because so many lives ended almost as soon as they had begun. But here's the question the average never answers. What happened to the children who survived? The ones who made it past the fragile early years when every fever could be a goodbye and every winter a roll of the dice. If you survived childhood in Tudor England, and many people did, your odds of living into your 50s or 60s or even beyond were not dramatically worse than in many pre-modern societies. Thomas Cromwell was executed at 55, not dead of old age. Catherine Parr died in her 30s from childbirth complications, not from natural decline. William Shakespeare made it to 52. Elizabeth I ruled until she was 69. These are not exceptions hiding in the margins. They were people who had successfully navigated the dangerous passage from childhood to adulthood and then kept living for decades more. The myth of the 35-year lifespan survives because it is dramatic and because it flatters us. It makes the past feel impossibly distant. A graveyard where everyone died young and nothing lasted, and we're the lucky ones who finally figured out how to stay alive. But that version of history erases the actual experience of Tudor people. It imagines them as ghosts who barely existed before disappearing, when in truth many of them grew old and watched their children grow old and buried their spouses and remarried and buried friends and kept living through all of it. Think about what that means for intimacy and desire in the shape of a human life. A woman who survived childbirth at 20 could expect to live another 30 or 40 years. A man who made it past the hazards of childhood and young adulthood could look forward to decades of work and love and fatherhood and maybe even grandfatherhood. Tudor England was not populated entirely by teenagers and young parents stumbling toward an early grave. It was filled with weathered faces and gray hair and bodies that had carried their owners through decades of plague and harvest failure and political chaos and the quiet exhaustion of simply surviving. There is something almost tender about the way this particular lie gets told. We mean well when we repeat the 35-year statistic. We're trying to honor how hard life was, how fragile, how easily a tooth infection or a bad pregnancy could end everything. But in flattening the past into a single number, we lose something important. We lose the image of a Tudor grandmother sitting by the fire watching her grandchildren play. We lose the Tudor grandfather who still remembered the Wars of the Roses and could tell stories about a world that had already disappeared. We lose the lovers who grew old together in cottages that no longer stand. The real tragedy of Tudor mortality was not that everyone died young. It was that so many children died before they had a chance to live. That was the heartbreak. That was the wound that never fully healed. Parents buried children with terrible frequency. Mothers watched babies fade from fevers that modern medicine would cure with a single prescription. Fathers carried small coffins to churchyards and went home to empty cradles. The grief of Tudor England was not the grief of a short life. It was the grief of love interrupted, the grief of planting a child and watching them wither before they could bloom. And yet people kept loving, kept having children, kept naming newborns after the siblings who had died the year before, because memory and hope are both stubborn things. A Tudor woman who gave birth 6 times might watch 4 of those children die before their 5th birthday and still love the 2 who remained with an intensity that modern safety cannot replicate. That is not a statistic. That is a life. That is the taste of grief on the tongue every morning. That is the sound of a mother humming to a sick child while knowing there is nothing she can do except stay awake and hold on. The 35-year average also hides something else. It hides the bodies that kept living despite everything. The Tudor men and women who worked their fields and stirred their pots and made love in the dark and argued about money and worried about their grown children and celebrated weddings and mourned funerals and woke up every morning to a world that had not killed them yet. They were not fragile. They were not short-lived. They were survivors. Every gray hair was a victory. Every wrinkled hand had outlasted disease and accident and the casual cruelty of a world without antibiotics. So the next time someone tells you that Tudor people died at 35, ask them what that number actually means. Ask them about the children who did not make it and the parents who buried them and the grandparents who watched it all happen from the other side of 60. The past was not a country where everyone died young. It was a country where death visited more often and stayed longer and took the smallest ones first. And the people who lived through that were not so different from us. They wanted to survive. They wanted to love. They wanted to grow old next to someone who knew their name. And many of them did. Now from the years they lived, let us bring these stories home. The truth that connects all these lies into one question worth carrying with you.